Well, good morning or good afternoon, and a warm welcome to all. You've joined the session Accessibility in Digital Collections, which will review strategies and opportunities to ensure that collections are accessible and encourage exploration and participation by all. This is the last technical training workshop in Module 1 of the Digital Empowerment Project, a nationwide initiative organized by the 6 U.S. regional museum associations that is dedicated to providing free, self-paced training resources for small museums. This inaugural series of online trainings and resource toolkits focused on digital media and technology topics is made possible by funding from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. My name is Zinnia Willits, and I am the Executive Director of the Southeastern Museums Conference. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a light-skinned white female with shoulder-length reddish-brown hair, which I let go curly today due to the high humidity down here. I'm wearing black rimmed glasses that are often referred to as cat-eye style. I'm wearing an olive green V-neck sleeveless dress, and I'm sitting in front of a backdrop of my home office, which is basically a desk and a computer. As the host for today's session, I would like to convey a few things to our attendees before we begin the program. The Digital Empowerment Leadership Team chose digital accessibility and inclusion as the first module in recognition of the fact that it is often the interaction between persons with impairments or disabilities and attitudinal, environmental, and technological barriers that hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. To prioritize digital accessibility is to actively work to break down those barriers. This first foundational model has provided training on how to integrate accessibility and inclusion into digital programs, social pages, and websites. Also, in this era of virtual meetings, when digital spaces may substitute our physical sense of place, it is important to reflect on the land we each occupy and honor the Indigenous people who have called it home. I'm speaking to you from Charleston, South Carolina, the historical homelands of the Natchez-Cusco peoples. Wherever we are, let us acknowledge all Indigenous nations as living communities, their elders both past and present, as well as future generations. We, the Digital Empowerment Project team, recognize that our organizations and those of our members were founded within a colonizing society that perpetuated the exclusions and erasures of many Native peoples throughout the United States and beyond. We ask you to reflect on the place where you reside and work, and to respect the diversity of cultures and experiences that form the richness of our world and our profession. So now finally, it is my pleasure to introduce today's instructors, Sina Baram and Corey Timpson. Sina is the president of Prime Access Consulting, which is an inclusive design firm. He is an accessibility consultant, computer scientist, researcher, speaker, and entrepreneur. Corey Timpson is the principal of Corey Timpson Design. He is an active collaborator and thought leader in experience design and inclusive museum discourses within the cultural sector. You can learn more about our presenters from their full bios, which are available on the Museum Learning Hub website. I'm thankful for the time that each has devoted to this session, and now I am pleased to turn the floor over to Sina and Corey to begin the presentation.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Pleasure for us to be back for our third session. And this session is titled Accessibility in Digital Collections, and I'm just getting my screen share set up. Like the previous sessions, we're going to go through some slides as quickly as possible and then open up things to conversation so that we can have as much conversation and discourse as we can. All right, can I get just some feedback from anyone on the team that you can see my slides and that they are advancing? Anyone?
I would offer Corey, but having the blind guy give you visual confirmation is probably not the way to go.
You're all good.
We're good.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the verbal.
So just starting off with our ethos again, it really, if you've attended either of the last two sessions, you've seen this already. And the concept is really that instead of designing and developing something and then figuring out how to make it accessible, we really want to consider all vectors of human difference at the outset. This is of particular importance when we think about collections management and information management at large. Museums are built upon a collection, and no matter what the composition of that collection ends up being, if it's archival, if it's 2D material, if it's 3D objects, if it's born digital assets, if it's intangible heritage, we really want to think about this ethos and the idea of like, what are we collecting? How are we managing that collection? So that later on, when we start thinking about how we're going to use that collection, we're already set up to be in a good position. So even when we're crafting or developing a policy, we really try and follow this ethos. Getting into collections management practice, there is a potential tension that exists between visitors who have access needs and those who are responsible for the preservation of an object, conservation requirements around an object, and just really about being a steward of that object's, preservation over time. So that tension, may exist, but it need not be the case where that tension is a negative. It's like, how can we understand those two scenarios that maybe the object finds itself in the middle of and use that in a positive way? So, the point is basically that collections policies can impact inclusion when we think about environmental sensitivity, et cetera, and how we treat our objects, how we care for them. What we do with them, if we can make deliberate decisions around how we're acquiring, how we're managing that collection and how we're presenting it, then we can really think about inclusion and access in a positive manner. So some of the early things we want to think about is representational inclusion. If we look at the Baltimore Museum of Art, in the past year, they had a collections mandate where they only collected new art from women artists. They were trying to balance and make a greater equitable balance within their collections at large. But representational inclusion, when we're thinking of historically marginalized groups and communities, are we thinking about how we ensure representation on the artist side, on the donor side, within those collections? So that maybe leads us to think about our acquisition objectives as we start to lay out protocols and objectives that our policies fall within. And when we end up choosing object, specimen, archival material, let's think about the groups that are often not as represented as they could be. We want to also focus on evidence-based consideration of what can be accessed, who can access things, how people go about accessing things within our collection, and what is really safe. And if we're really deliberate around these and understanding, what can be accessed in which ways, then we can really start to think about how we make our collections more accessible to a larger audience. So we want to provide clear messaging and communication around an object's restrictions. And this is really important. A lot of museums have touch tours. It's not that no one can ever touch the object. Obviously, we don't want everyone touching the object at all times, but what are the scenarios under which we can facilitate a different modality of access to an object than just the visual modality? Or visual mode. And we want to ensure that our policies and any of the tactics that we create within this scenario don't contradict preservation, but rather acknowledge preservation requirements and also facilitate accessibility. So providing clear messaging and communication with the staff as well as with the public is really important to ensure that, again, that tension that exists is a positive one that's used constructively, but not to create a barrier for access.
A couple of examples on that previous point. Imagine somebody using their phone, but not to take pictures, just because there's a magnifier app on their phone, and they're able to use that as an assistive technology. So having a flat very unnuanced, no phones allowed in the gallery policy prevents that from happening, but it really doesn't help preservation either, right? So we can then talk about whether a flashlight is admissible, the flashlight feature on the phone is admissible or not. Certain objects have lighting restrictions, others don't. So in a low light environment, could you use your phone as that kind of assistive technology? It's things like this that go a really long way to adding some nuance, but a lot more inclusion at the policy level and then through staff to be implemented with the public. So talking about documentation and registration, I mean, let's think through, for example, what are those things, those pieces of knowledge that we gain during the documentation practices and the registration practices of objects that can be instrumental for enhancing visual descriptions and other accessible information about objects that's not only helpful for visitors with disabilities, but really makes the information we have about objects helpful for everybody, right? So for example, imagine that you've got an object, and we'll see an example of this in the next slide. Think about its weight, right? Think about when it was being handled. How did it feel to the touch? How was the balance? How was the temperature? Right? Was it cold or warm to the touch? What are the ornate details that would translate across modalities? Was it rough? Was it smooth? These kinds of things. Also thinking about the general condition of the object. Does it look rather pristine or a little bit aged? Talking about things like patina when we talk about blades and other objects of that nature. These attributes, these physical properties, we don't often think about them a lot in terms of maybe something the visitor would be interested in, but they really can enhance our descriptions of objects and make them more multisensory, even if the object itself is not able to be touched for preservation reasons. So what we see here on this slide is some swords as the objects in question with some scabbards. And thinking about those previous properties that I mentioned, think about the weight, think about the balance, think about how it felt to the touch. These are pieces of information we could include to really arrive at an enhanced description of the object that, again, not only I, as a blind visitor to a museum, would be interested in, but Corey would be interested in as well, even though he can see the object behind glass, right? So then turning our attention to preservation, what is that knowledge that we, that we can use, the knowledge we've gained during the research and preservation practices that can enhance our descriptions and conveying of knowledge? So think about, for example, the tools that are used. We don't often think of this as part of accessibility or making things more inclusive, but imagine the kinds of information someone can infer from tools like, oh, there's this object with many, many feathers on it, and these small tweezers were used in the act of preparing the object for display or preserving something about it. Think about the remnants or fragments that would come up during these processes that themselves could act as tactile pieces. These are the kinds of things that we don't associate with necessarily something that we would put on display, but if we do think about it creatively like that, we can make a much more inclusive and accessible experience. The example we see on this next slide, arts and conservation tools, everything from light magnifying goggles to brushes, knives, little picks, these kinds of things, and they can give you a sense of scale and a sense of the practice, which, by the way, again, not only interesting from an accessibility perspective, but really enhances the experience for all visitors. The next example we see on this slide is, speaking of ornate details, these are some bricks from a turret of a historic house. This is out of Joplin, Missouri, in addition to some tiles from the roof. We were at this project site, and we actually saw a pile of this stuff sitting outside, basically waiting for the folks to come and take it away to the garbage dump. And we immediately had the reaction of, no, hold on, let's capture a few of those pieces. Don't throw that away, because that would be gold when you want to let somebody touch something that is 30 feet above them on the roof. It's not practical to go let somebody touch that on the exterior of this historic house, but we've got the tiles right here that could be touched and can act as these learning objects and tactile objects for enhancing accessibility. Corey, back over to you.
Yep. So Probably the question that we get, or the subtopic that we discuss the most when it comes to inclusive design and accessibility in collections, is that tension between environmental conditions and accessibility. And so, we're all familiar with like lux levels and like what the lighting scenarios might be, how we manage humidity and temperature controls, sound in the spaces, all of these things. Often, the default is object in a case, kind of behind glass, out of reach. And it's important to realize that if we're deliberate, again, in our consideration of each one of these things, then we can not only add safe conditions for the object, but we can create greater access to the object as well. So like Sina was mentioning, the previous tactics can surface a lot more information, for collections. And provide access. Let's keep on that theme and think about like light management. Well, in many galleries, there's often a lot of glare that can be really disruptive for a lot of different visitors who are trying to see the objects. So if we think about strictly how we manage light, we can reduce glare, we can impact sensory loads, we can create focus highlights by lighting certain things in a way and not lighting certain things in another way. And so we can actually assist the inclusive design and accessibility of a space overall by thinking really deliberately about lighting, and the low lighting conditions can actually help us in this regard and not be a contradiction.
Sorry to interject, Corey, but like we just had a client here, 14-person museum. This doesn't have to be hard. And the facilities manager just went around adjusting the lighting after a lecture that we gave with them. This was not a $20,000 project or anything like that. It was a couple of hours, went around and adjusted some of the lighting around the museum just to enhance in the way that Corey is talking about. So don't think that this has to be an entire project to make a massive difference for the visitor.
Absolutely. And there's digital interventions that can take place. And these don't have to be really expensive interventions. They can be, the fact that people are walking around with mobile devices in their pockets, and how do we take advantage of that? And Sina already mentioned just the ability to zoom on something and explore details, or to use the flashlight as needed. This is a more elaborate example, but we want to show it because the buzz, everyone's talking about augmented reality, virtual reality, and this is one use case. Now, this production that we developed cost about $12,000, so it's pretty expensive in particular for a lot of small museums. But this type of technology is only becoming cheaper and cheaper. We did this project about 4 years ago. Now there's technology that exists like ARKit for a web browser, which means augmented reality can basically be done in a lot more cost-effective manner with a lot less specialized knowledge. It's only getting better. So here we want to focus on the lesson. The idea is these objects, these textiles, were in this climate-controlled case. We're restricted by the low light conditions, by the humidity and temperature control, and you have to kind of like peer into the case to be able to see the object. We also have a limitation on how much content we can fit on the artifact label. So what we did is we created, you can see there's iPads to the left of it. We created an augmented reality application to help enhance the access to these objects under low lighting condition. What does that mean? Well, it means that you can image recognize the artifact. So we high-res photograph the object. We put it in a digital environment. In this case, it was an app, but it could be through a web browser these days. The camera of the app recognizes the image, and this would allow visitors to zoom, pinch and zoom, and scale in and view the fine details of the object that they wouldn't otherwise be able to see very easily through the glass. It also meant that we could surface a visual description on the iPads for visitors who are low vision or blind who can't see the object. We're able to add supplemental interpretation. If you can see the details, there's little blue hotspots on the object. They can be clicked, and you can hear an oral history by the creator of the object telling a story. So we're able to increase access for everyone, increase accessibility. It's facilitating inclusion because everyone's able to do it together. And we're further able to add more interpretation than we could fit on the artifact label. Additionally, because it's image recognized, anyone could use an image. It doesn't have to be the actual artifact itself that gets recognized. So educators in the classroom were able to use this as a learning tactic or tool with their classroom. So, we're increasing access in that way by engaging a remote audience through digital means of people who weren't able to make it into the museum in person. It doesn't have to be augmented reality. That was a fancy way of doing it. But there's no reason that we can't have objects just digitized or imaged and put into our website, made available through the mobile app. If we have the rights, the copyright to be able to do so, then we can make this content available digitally to a remote audience. If there is rights restrictions around things, then we can start to get fancy and do things like geofence the content. So we can make it available digitally, but say only accessible if you're using the museum Wi-Fi. And that way we can manage the rights restrictions that we may be confronted by.
So turning our attention to visual description, which is something we mentioned in the first one of these webcasts, and Anna talked about audio description when discussing video in the second one. We thought it would be good to highlight this as a concept. So all visual description is the use of language to describe what is visually being depicted. And the reason that this is important is that it provides or can contribute to providing an equitable experience for someone who is unable to see the object or prefers another modality like text or audio to know what is going on. So what we want to be careful of is that a visual description is not the same thing as a caption. So when you go to a website and there's a caption underneath a photo, maybe it says something like Grand Canyon 2015, something like that. That's a caption. That's available for everybody. I can access it on my computer using a program called a screen reader because it reads it out to me. Other folks like Corey can see it on their screen. That's fine. That's a caption. A visual description, sometimes some of you may have heard the term alt text or alternative text. That's the description of what is happening in that image for someone who's unable to see it traditionally. It turns out, by the way, that these visual descriptions are helpful for everybody, not just people who can't see the photo or can't see the object. Noting here that this is oftentimes a field in a content management system. So even something as simple as WordPress or something very complicated like backend software that museums use from TMS and other collections management systems, there's a field to provide this information so that we can make these objects more accessible, especially to those with low or no vision. So visual descriptions, I apologize. So it's important to remember also that when we think about visual descriptions, there's all sorts of variants there. So just one quick note that we can talk about more in the discussion and Q&A section, that there are short and long visual descriptions. There's all of these different types of ways of describing objects. That's in the practice of it. We want to just make sure we're surfacing the concept that exists of describing something. So let's take a look at an example of that. So we've got a painting by Kerry James Marshall. For audio reasons, just for some IT reasons, we're going to play the audio from my phone. So I will hold this close to the camera in order to make this happen. Let's see if it does. 1 second, forgive the phone usage, and I apologize. But you do at least get to hear a screen reader in action, which is kind of cool. Okay, so I'm going to hit play, and I'm going to hold this up to the microphone.
This painted portrait depicts a young woman with jet black skin holding a long, thin paintbrush up to a colorful, messy painter's palette. She is shown in a three-quarter pose, gazing directly at the viewer. Her face, which is central to the square composition, stands out against a large white canvas, almost blending into the pitch black background to her right. Closer inspection reveals, however, that her skin is subtly rendered, with various shades of contours and highlights. She wears 2 large hoop earrings, 3 small hoop earrings, and an oversized, boxy, high-collared jacket made of stiff fabric. Her voluminous hair, black with an ochre sheen, rises in thick coils on top of her head. The canvas to her left shows a partly finished paint-by-number self-portrait. In it, her likeness is broken up into smaller segments with pale blue outlines and numbers. She has outlined many of the segments and filled them in with colors from her palette: orange, blue, yellow, pink, brown, and a few shades of green. She uses brighter, more vivid colors to paint her jacket on the paint-by-number canvas. using bright oranges and greens rather than the deep mustards and maroons that are on the real-life jacket.
So that's an example of long-form visual description. That's from the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, and came out of a project that we developed with them called the Coyote Visual Description Platform. And we can talk about that more in the Q&A. But we just think that's so cool because it is an example of a visual description, yes, but it itself, to me, is incredibly artistic. It's an incredibly beautiful description to try to bring more equitable experiences and access to these objects, which are primarily thought of as being visual.
And just maybe just to emphasize, it is not interpreted. It's not interpretive, rather. It is really a visual description. So when we run visual description workshops, that's always kind of the biggest point for us is to, when we do those workshops, we pick items, first of all, from the collection that Sina and I don't know. Because what ends up happening is people who are more familiar with the item, with the artifact from the collection, end up adding sort of naturally insights into their visual description that get into interpretation. So, on on a meeting we had this morning, Sina remarked, like, he and I had no idea what people were talking about because it wasn't apparent in the image of the artifact itself, but was things that the staff understood because they work with the collection a lot. So just to note that's one of the critical points within this concept.
No, that's a great reminder. This difference between interpretation and visual description, right? The kind of golden rule of visual description is say what you see. It's a good rule of thumb. Noting time here, just on turning our attention to discourse. Essentially, a lot of discourse these days, it happens online. It happens in these digital spheres, right? Whether it's Twitter or social media like Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn, all of that stuff, as well as things like blog posts or media, more longer form social media. And so when we're capturing these materials, these outputs, this content for thinking about preservation and conservation, it's really important to make sure we're not just capturing that tweet with an image in it, we're also capturing the visual description that somebody has written. Because on platforms like Twitter and Instagram, you can visually describe, just like you heard from my phone playing that audio file there, you can type in the text for an image that you're posting, making that more accessible to someone who can't see. So capturing that info in addition to the post itself is really, really critical. And then this information is not only helpful because it's part of the piece and should be captured, of course, and also can help you make these objects more accessible when you go to present them to the public, but it's also helpful to future museum professionals, right? Because that is an additional source of information about the object itself. In terms of data and information management, there's a lot more to the collection than the physical objects like we've been talking about. So there's the associated data with it, like the metadata I just gave, who sent the tweet, for example, on a Born Digital object, or provenance information, these things that we're familiar with in museological practice. There's Born Digital artifacts like we've been discussing, social media posts and web pages and content of that nature. There's intangible heritage, right? Corey always makes this key distinction. Think of a dance from indigenous peoples, right? When you think of a dance like that, only a video capture of it may be documenting it, sure, but it's not preserving it, because an intrinsic aspect of the dance is the interpretive qualities and interpretation itself that the individual performing that dance brings to that piece of intangible heritage. So just having a video file is not enough. So let's think about that in our preservation practices so we don't accidentally perform these kinds of erasures that sometimes happen. And also thinking about the systems we use, and we'll see some examples of these on the next slide briefly. These systems all contribute to the accessibility of the material we're talking about. Some of them support visual descriptions, others support magnification, others can support having the text be accessible, not just a photo of the text. So we want to make sure that we're just thinking about these systems and how they participate in our digital ecosystem to facilitate accessibility. In terms of just metadata, we are creating and collecting and managing this data across all these different systems. So some examples of those briefly, and then we can talk further about specifics in the Q&A, are things like collections management systems, right? Digital asset management system. So a collections management system would reason about the objects and the provenance and things of this nature. Digital asset management system may be the thing that serves up those photos, serves up those files, and does a little bit of rights management for you. Content management systems, the thing that maybe manages the website, or in larger organizations, an enterprise-wide content management system. And then, of course, archival and library management systems for information specific to that domain. So you have all these different kinds of systems. Maybe you have one program that does it all, and that's fine too. But how do we then consider and prioritize inclusion and accessibility into these systems when we're using them so that we can make our collections more accessible? Corey, over to you.
Yep. Just quickly shifting gears, you've probably heard about open access. It's been a big movement in the cultural sector over the last, say, 8 years, but really gaining a lot of traction in the last 3 years. And then, of course, last year, the Smithsonian launched its open access program. And so, you know, the concept behind open access is access in general. So who has access to data and how, and this is a consideration for inclusion as well. So open access, basically the definition right there, is a mechanism by which research outputs are distributed online. You know, they're normally paired with, you know, a Creative Commons and open licensing model that removes restrictions on use and reuse and starts to get around some of those issues that we were talking about earlier about that would require something like geofencing. So open access is something that we should all consider. You know, if we're a steward of the public's collection, of its heritage, then, you know, open access is a really important tactic and facility to ensure that we provide the public with access to their own collections. You know, why does it matter? Well, I think it's kind of what we're talking about, is increasing access to human knowledge. This is one of these core museological responsibilities. You know, if we think about the ongoing trust relationship that museums share with the public, and how to evolve that trust relationship as people's expectations evolve and our behaviors change over time, then certainly open access is kind of having its moment right now. And, you know, we want to be careful though, because we have all kinds of biases built into the legacy of the systems and infrastructure that we're using. And we want to ensure that we don't perpetuate bias as we make things open. So, you know, this is something for us to consider. Sina just mentioned, you know, this idea of larger institutions having content management systems that manage more than just their website. And so something that we really fully believe in is this idea of enterprise content management. And, you know, some of those systems that you may or may not use that Sina just ran through is we want to really, when we're thinking about inclusion and access, make deliberate decisions about the nature of those systems, how they share information with one another or share information in general, and know that, you know, further down the line, we want to have as few barriers as possible, not only in our intentions, but how we can actually execute those intentions. And even just removing the museum subject from the equation and thinking about things in purely data and information terms, we really want to be as interoperable between systems and information sources as we possibly can be, so that when we want to do something, you know, years from now that we haven't even thought of right now, it's going to cost us a lot less time and a lot less money to be able to do whatever we need to do. And enterprise content management and the methodology around there, that concept is going to help us get there. This is kind of more details on that. I don't think that we need to get too far into enterprise content management on this talk. But just to say, you don't have to have expensive content or collection management systems in order to take advantage of this. You may be using, you know, a database. You may be using an Excel spreadsheet or Google Sheets or something like that. And the idea is to always think about, it really is just data and information. And how are we going to best use that in the future? We're not quite sure, so let's be as open and flexible as we can be. Leading into some final thoughts, you know, we mentioned this, I think, in the previous 2 sessions, but when you're thinking about your website, use WordPress over other platforms. The main thing here is WordPress comes with a content management system. So back to what we were just talking about, that may help structure some of your information and your data. And if you're surfacing collections through your website, that as well, in a way that you may be able to use that data and information in a scalable way in the future. Put as much as you can on your website. If you can put label information and visual descriptions and artifacts online, then that's great. At the Corning Museum of Glass, they have the artifact labels for all of the objects on their website. And then in Gallery, they let you know where you can find it online. That's great because now they've just made their artifact labels accessible because everyone's mobile device has a screen reader and can read the text out for people who can't see or hear, can't see or view the label. And this bottom point here is kind of what we've gotten to with this. This is a session on digital collections. We spend a lot of time talking about different aspects of the collections, but that's because we consider all collections to be digital collections. Even if it's a 3D object that may not be digital, all of the associated information and data around that object is digital. It's not being composed on a typewriter. It's born digital in Word or Google Doc or something like that. So let's consider things digitally because that's only going to allow us to distribute that information in more ways and make sure that that information is more accessible. Ultimately, your museum is built upon your collection. So if we can ensure that the collection is inclusive and accessible, we're going to go a long way to ensuring that our programs are inclusive and accessible. The workflows through which we manage our collections, and the assets are critical in this context. Visual description is likely not in everybody's workflow, but when we're cataloging an object, if we can just add a part to our workflow that, say, fills out the visual description, then it is there for when we want and need to use it. And when we consider our museological practices in the context of inclusive design, we can enable greater accessibility, which means we can extend our reach and we can satisfy many of the strategic performance objectives and measures that we all have for our organizations. And with that, we can jump into the discussion.
Am I back? Okay. Thank you to you both. As somebody who spent 17 years in the collections world, it was really interesting for me to listen to what you were saying and think back on the many object and artwork descriptions I've done over the years, and really thinking about the weight and the texture and just adding in simple, simple more descriptors to what we're writing that was helpful. So we have a few questions from our attendees, and if you're listening or watching, please continue to drop them into the chat, and they will get relayed to me through the magic of technology across the stratosphere here. But I'm going to start with a simple one. I think it was from Sina. What software did you use on the iPad?
So this is built right in. In fact, if you want a more detailed demo of this, we have one in the first video of the series, in the first webcast, but it's built right into your iOS device. So any Apple device from iPhone, Apple Watch, iPad has it. It's called VoiceOver. You can just ask Siri to turn it on. So you can say, I'm not going to say her name, but her name, turn on VoiceOver. And it's also, if you go to settings, under accessibility, there is a whole slew of assistive technologies. There's a magnifier, there's a black and white mode, there is switch-based access for those who are not able to use the screen. There is the screen reader called VoiceOver, all hearing aid compatibility. All of that is built into your iOS devices. And so that is what I was using as somebody who's blind in order to be able to use a device like an iPhone. And that's exactly what your visitors can use to pull up that's why, like, if you take nothing else from this presentation, that point Corey made, put as much as you can on your website. Because then I, as somebody who's blind, maybe you don't have accessible labels. Maybe you don't have these other things figured out. As long as I can get to that label information, I can pull it up on my phone and read it right there in the gallery. That won't work for everyone, but it's a really easy win that you can have.
Thank you, Sina. So this next question the attendee says, I often get pinged on the length of my alternative text when running an accessibility checker. Is there an ideal length for alternative text? It's a great question. I have that one as well.
This is a fantastic question. So alternative text is used for a couple of different purposes on websites and mobile apps. So sometimes when it's a picture of a menu, the only thing the alt text should say is menu or lunch menu, because then you click on it as a link and it goes to a page that has the proper lunch menu. Apparently I'm hungry, given the example. But that's one form where you want short alt text. You don't want leather-bound book with ornate writing describing lunch, right? Like, you don't want that because it's a link. The image is acting as a link, as a control, as we, from a technical perspective. But if you're talking about an artwork, or you're talking about something that is not a link or a button, it is actually a thing that we want people to appreciate, the accessibility checker is wrong. Please feel free to put in appropriate alt text, and also feel free to send the accessibility checker my way, and we'll set them right. So do you, and make sure you do that, right? What I would say is, for shorter descriptions, typically folks have been settling on a sentence or so. That's like short, right? Really short. And then for longer descriptions, it really varies institution for institution. 50 words to 350 words, believe it or not, is as wide as the range can be. What I would say is, if you're going over 50 words, maybe the alt text is not the place to put that description. Think about surfacing that visual description for everybody and putting that description right there on the page. You could have the shorter description in the alt text, and then the longer description for everyone to appreciate right there on that web page or on the mobile app. And that way, you're kind of getting the best of both worlds. And the reason that that's important is, when you have really long pieces of text, my screen reader, both on my laptop and my phone, it lets me navigate by paragraph. It lets me have structure. Whereas with alt text, you just got to listen to it from beginning to end. You don't get any of that structure in the text.
And maybe something worth just adding here as related, we mentioned it, I believe, in the first session as well, but if you weren't there, is that completing these alt texts and descriptions is helping with your search engine optimization. So how search engines will prioritize and find your content. So, there's a traffic and sort of viewership audience reach that gets increased, not just in terms of accessibility, but in terms of how search engines will consume the information and make your content more findable for anyone looking for it.
Okay, thank you. This next question is very related to what you were just talking about, but I'm going to read it slightly different. But in regards to content presentation, are there pros or cons of presenting a series of photos of one piece with short alt text versus hiding multiple pictures of the same piece and thereby bypassing the alt text and simply providing a longer form description of the piece?
Absolutely. I would do both. I would do the short descriptions on the alt text, just so somebody has the understanding that it's the front or back or top level view of the object. And then, like, this comes up with sculpture a lot. You've got the front shot, you've got the different lighting, perhaps orientation, that sort of thing, and then do the long form description of the piece in real life. So the real visual description of the whole thing. Why do you want to do that? Why not just hide the images like you're saying? Because imagine if I want to capture one of those images and send it over to my friend Corey. I can't now do that if you've hidden those images, right? You've removed them from the ability of the blind user from accessing them on the page. So do the short description just to differentiate them, but you could be super short, David front, something like that, David back, something along these lines, front view, back view, and then do the proper visual description on the page of the whole object.
And just to say, there's a parallel here for in-gallery presentation as well. So, we were dealing with a scenario this morning where there was one artifact label for a series of works, there's 48 different sort of prints within like a salon hang in the gallery. And it was like, well, there's one label, but there's a visual description that we want to create for the installation, if we want to call it an installation, as well as then the visual description for each of the 48 different prints that composes that. And we want to create a hierarchy there so that, people again, can go as deep or as shallow as they want to when they're exploring that. But it's interesting because when we come up with these scenarios for online, it's often very similar to the scenarios we put into place in the gallery. So not like we just have to adapt and evolve what we're doing for the different channels or medium, but often very much the same kind of approach.
Okay, thank you for those answers. This next question is pretty interesting, and I think that there's probably many out there that might be in this situation, but I work at a historic house museum, and I'm wondering how the suggestions in your presentation can be applied to visitors on guided tours or for a collection currently without technology.
Yeah, I think the concepts are still the same. So let's take visual description as an example. You know, we're talking about surfacing it through digital means. But you know, Sina and I have been to a bunch of historic house museums, and you know, even just museums in general that don't have a large sort of digital, you know,
infrastructure.
Infrastructure, yeah. And like the best is when we can weave description into the tour that is already being given and then expand upon it. But that could be delivered through the tour guide, or through the docent, through the person working in the space, as easily as it can be delivered, you know, through a mobile device. So I'd say that, you know, it's not so much the mechanism of delivery as it is, like Sina and I like to break out, creating the affordance and then surfacing the affordance in the way that's most appropriate for the context in which we're working. And so in this case, say, you know, like we've been in some historic house where the house is the object, is the primary artifact. And, you know, then we want to treat that artifact in the same way, develop those affordances, but maybe they're not being presented through a mobile device or through a website. Maybe they're being developed and presented through humans.
Some of the most enjoyable experiences I've had, and I'm as techie as it gets, have been with my phone in my pocket, right? Not using it at all. It's just a conversation with someone. They're like, oh, check out this banister, right? Check out this wall and the textural difference between that and the stairs. Come upstairs with me and I'm gonna describe the lighting to you, right? And those could be one-on-one tours. They could be visual description tours, or they could be part of, as Corey is saying, woven into the tour, again, for everyone to enhance the multisensory nature. Think about the places in the house that might have a cold draft or might have something else going on that's a different sensory modality. Think about objects that normally you don't want folks to touch, but if you're happy to have somebody wear some, you know, art gloves, like preservation gloves, and then occasionally have your blind or low vision visitors touch them, you can offer those enhanced opportunities. Just really imagining a different experience. Don't think of the tech as the only way to achieve that. That's just one way of surfacing this stuff.
Yeah, I think one of the most incredible tour experiences that I've been on was one of the tours I went on at the Tenement Museum in New York. And so there, the building is the artifact, and it's all about the interpretation of the guide who's leading you through. And of course, they have different tours that basically expose different stories, but they really, other than walking through the old apartments, don't really want you to touch anything. But they really did an incredible job at surfacing the characteristics, multimodal characteristics. So what people would have smelled, what things feel like, etc. So the same sort of principles that Sina was talking about when trying to catalog the sword and surfacing those properties that may not fit into your typical controlled vocabulary fields, they surfaced those deliberately because they didn't want people like touching the house, the apartments, more than they were already doing by walking through them. So they surfaced those qualities as part of the script that they were delivering, and that made it, that was able to translate that experience for us.
Okay, thank you both. So we have a little less than 5 minutes left for questions. So I'm going to try and get 2 more in. First, and this has come in kind of in multiple forms, but can maybe each of you share your favorite museums with online collections or online exhibitions that exemplify accessibility?
No. And the reason I don't want to put anybody under that kind of microscope. I don't think that's
Okay.
fair to them. But let me give you some aspects of those that are good. The ones that don't try to be fancy. So if you are doing nothing more than having some photos on a WordPress website, but they're able to be zoomed in on, and they're able to have visual descriptions, and they're able to be used on an iPhone and on a web browser, that is so much more rewarding at the end of the day than when you compare yourself to individuals that have hundreds of thousands of dollars to spend on an online collection and are essentially achieving the exact same outcome, and oftentimes in a less accessible way, right? The 3D tour and the VR and everything is cute and all, but if it's not accessible, it doesn't mean anything to me, right? And so I hear the ask for examples of inclusion and accessibility, but it's really important to keep in mind that these aspects that we're talking about here, these concepts are really what matters. I wouldn't get too distracted by some of the exemplar or best in class examples that everybody talks about in the museum field, but in my opinion, for some of the wrong reasons, you know? I don't know, Corey, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that of all the collections that we see, no one does a comprehensively good job. Different organizations do a good job within certain aspects of making their collections accessible. You know, hey, you know, Smithsonian, great job. The 19 organizations within the Smithsonian that we worked with in order to make open access happen. But how many of the what was it, like 4.5 million or something?
2.4 million originally, something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
But how many have visual descriptions?
Right, like a handful, right? And then you could say, well, the Cooper Hewitt Museum in New York, over the pandemic, while they were shut down, they were actually able to keep staff from being furloughed by getting them to write visual descriptions. So they did 6,000 visual descriptions of items within their collection. That's amazing. That's a really good point. Now, are all their collections accessible? No. So like it's kind of like we can cherry pick little pieces like that, which in most cases leads us to say, well, there's no really great examples, but there are many great examples. They're just not comprehensive, I guess.
Okay, that's fair enough. That's great advice. So this is the final question, and it's kind of a long one, but I think you'll probably just have a closing thought on it. Could you talk just a bit more about tools like, I think this was supposed to be Coyote, to help centralize the workflow for visual descriptions and make their reuse across platforms more efficient? I feel like we do a lot of rewriting and copying and pasting between images on our website and in MailChimp and in Twitter, etc. How can we write once and publish to all?
Yes. I'll talk about Coyote in one sec. Corey, do you want to briefly talk about the Enterprise Content Management System at CMHR as your closing, and then I'll close this out with Coyote.
Sure. So the Enterprise Content Management System at the Human Rights Museum that we designed and developed was a archival, library, and museum collections management system, digital asset management system, web content management system, a thesaurus, and an enterprise search appliance. All work together. They were all open source. They're all free. We ended up paying some licensing fees to get like more support. And then I had people on my team, you know, sort of integrate the systems. But the idea there was we would store an asset once. We were able to map the different fields of the different systems against one another so that we could present that item wherever we wanted. So the Human Rights Museum has 97 different digital installations in the 50,000 square foot exhibitions, a bunch of social media channels, digital channels for outreach, etc. But the same digital asset could be used in a study table in gallery, could be projected on the side of the building outside, was used in, you know, like social media posts. It was always that same asset. So we stored it once, we mapped the systems, and then we could reference it out as many times as we want. So that was, you know, the greatest piece of technology at that museum. It was completely not sexy, but it allowed us to really be effective and efficient when we wanted to use the collections, you know, in ways that we hadn't even thought of using them yet. So that's what we were getting to when we were saying the enterprise content management methodology, and it can be done in a number of different ways. Cleveland Art Museum has done a great job in doing the same thing recently.
with respect to Coyote, Coyote is a also open source tool, and it can be hosted as well. And if you're a small museum especially, please reach out. We're happy to work with you on making this affordable for you, because what it is a tool that can integrate especially well with WordPress websites, and other types are coming as well, that allows for the synthesis, the review, the editing, the publishing, and the storage of visual descriptions. You can have multiple alt texts, longer texts, shorter ones, sign language, what have you, for any object in your collection. And so it's an online platform that facilitates that workflow that was embedded in your in your question. This way you can have authors writing a description, but an editor coming along, maybe doing some copy editing, a curator chiming in with institutional knowledge about that piece, and someone to approve that description so that it can go live automatically on the website. And this way you're not stuck doing all of that work in a single edit field in WordPress, in a single edit field in Drupal. It basically takes visual description and treats it as a first-class citizen in your content management workflow. Happy to talk to you more about that offline.
I think that's a great place to end. And I also think this is a great discussion to continue on the online forum, because I just wrote down Coyote. So I think that there's going to be a lot of people that want to continue this. But we are at time. So I just want to say thank you all for attending today, and a huge thanks to you, Sina and Corey, for terrific presentations, and you know, the really practical takeaways in all of these technical trainings. And so just a few reminders. Again, visit the forum on the website. You'll have to create a login, but once you're in there, I really, we're excited about the discussions that we can continue on that platform. As always, follow us on social media. And finally, join us for the introduction/inspiration, which we're now calling the INSPO session, as we launch Module 2, which is going to focus on live streaming. And this session will feature two museum presenters, Ross Jordan of the Jane Addams Hull House Museum, and Christy McMillan from the Asheville Art Museum. This introductory session, you'll hear how Ross and Christy successfully developed live virtual programs, tours, and events with small budgets and very basic technology tools. So I have truly enjoyed being your host for Module 1, but we'll be turning over the floor next month to my colleague and Digital Empowerment Project partner, Dan Yeager, the Executive Director of the New England Museums Association, who I knew is going to do a fabulous job. We'll see if he tells you whether his hair is curly or straight during his visual descriptions. I don't know. But I've appreciated all of you being here. Thank you, everybody, for attending today, and have a fabulous day.
Thanks so much.